Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Rhonda Student Kaiser, and I'm the Director of Customer Engagement for BigFix, and I'll be hosting our webinar today. Today, we're going to be talking about strategies for Ubuntu patching. Ken, if you can go to the next slide, please. We are recording today's webinar. If this presents you with any concerns, please drop it this time. You'll be able to access a recording of the webinar about an hour after we conclude. You'll simply follow the same registration link that you used to join us, and you'll instead access a recording of the event. If you have colleagues who were unable to join us today, you'll be able to share your link with those colleagues. They'll click that link, they'll go in, they'll get a quick registration page, and they will be able to register and then get to the recording of the event. We do encourage you to ask questions throughout the course of the event. Just add your questions to the chat box and we'll answer either in the chat directly or we'll feed your questions to the presenters at the appropriate time. With me today are Ken Vendler. Ken is one of our BigFix technical advisors covering the Great Plains and Canada. Casey Cannady, BigFix Professional Services, the guy with the BigFix tattoo and resident roaming professional services person across the U.S., and Joe Saylor from our BigFix Accelerated Value Program. So Ken, I think, today we're going to be talking about strategies for Ubuntu patching. I know that, in my previous life, Linux administrators are kind of touchy about giving up any kind of control around doing patching. So this is it's almost like a religious conversation when we talk about patching with BigFix and centralizing some control and reporting around the capabilities. But I think today you have some compelling resources for us about how to get started with BigFix patching, how to have those conversations and make your program a success. Joe, I think you've also been through those religious wars. Maybe you want to add something to that as well before we dive in.
Yeah, my experience at customers, especially when you're trying to centralize patching and security items for Linux endpoints, even more so than in the Windows space, is like stuff gets really entrenched. Like those users do not, like they have a process, they do not want to give up their current process. It works well for them, even though it may be manual or more time consuming. Everything works, they know how to not crash their systems. So as we go through designing and building out the BigFix methodology for patching these systems, it's really important to use soft skills to take into consideration how you're getting those users to adopt what we're putting out. Because ultimately, it doesn't help you at all if they just use their admin credentials to remove BigFix because they don't like how you're patching. Right. So as we go through this, think about in your environment, like how you would convince your users to get on board with all these automation techniques.
All right, Ken, over to you.
Yep. So Rhonda and Joe, some very good points that you raised there. So with that in mind, you mentioned the territorial nature of, Linux admins. And to be fair, I think all sysadmins to some degree are territorial in that they're responsible for maintaining the operational capacity of the systems. And so anything that they see as a potential threat to that operational capacity, the uptime of their systems, they're a little bit wary of. 20 years ago, the big thing to brag about was your system uptime. I was reading an article some time ago about a open VMS server that had stayed up for over 20 years straight without any interruption. So not only were they not clearly patching it, but they also had a really good power grid wherever they were at, or had really good backups to their mains. And so it used to be, a badge of honor to say, yeah, my uptime is 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. Anymore, if you brag about your uptime like that, people look at you like, what are you doing? You're not patching your systems. And so to Joe's point, I had a customer that I was engaged with. They were using BigFix on the Windows side, and their Linux team heard about BigFix, and initially there was some resistance there because they asked me, are we going to lose control of our ability to patch? I said, no, our tool is actually going to give you more control because it's going to give you the visibility to see what patches your systems need, and also verify that those patches are in fact installed. So that's kind of what today's segment on patching Ubuntu is all about. I chose this topic because Ubuntu was the second Linux distribution that I ever started using. So all the way back in the Warthog days, the first actual public release of Ubuntu, that was the second Linux distribution I used. The original Red Hat Linux, Red Hat 7, was actually the first. So a lot of my customers, in fact, 2 that I've been working with this week, have been coming to me saying, how do we patch Ubuntu? And so with that in mind, I felt like this was an appropriate topic.
So tell me about these pictures, because they look a little, well, they look cool, but they also look a little creepy.
Yep. So that is all thanks to AI. So for those of our viewers that are familiar with Ubuntu, you'll probably recognize these animals. So from left to right, we have Bionic Beaver. We have, and these are all code name releases for the various long-term service releases of Ubuntu. So we have Bionic Beaver, followed by Focal Fossa, then Jammy Jellyfish, and then the latest release of Ubuntu 24.04, Noble Numbat. So fed a few prompts into AI and decided to generate some mildly whimsical, maybe slightly disturbing imagery here.
Straight out of the uncanny valley.
Yep.
I like the Bionic Beaver.
Maybe that can be
Yeah.
your next tattoo, Casey.
Possibly.
Yep. So yeah, essentially, we've got an Ubuntu petting zoo going on here today. So we'll take a look at that shortly. But before we actually get into the patching of Ubuntu, or really any operating system, we need to kind of take care of some prerequisites, because a lot of my customers come to me and say, hey, Ken, we want to patch Ubuntu, we want to patch RHEL, we want to patch, whatever. I say, okay, cool. So what's your desired outcome? And they'll look at me, we just told you we want to patch Ubuntu. I'm like, well, hold on. There are many ways that you can patch Ubuntu. And what is your desired outcome? Do you want to patch everything, quarterly? Do you want to have it patched monthly? Are you concerned with automating the patches? Do you want to manually push them out? Do you want to use something in between, like a baseline? So before you start working with the tool at all, and this really goes for any Linux distribution or any operating system, you're going to want to determine what your desired outcome is.
Yeah, and I think that we as engineers often kind of overlook the soft steps of gathering requirements. This whole thing is really focused around adoption from Linux users, and so gathering requirements from your users, negotiating what level of control that you're going to give your managed endpoints and give your users is really a key step here to, again, drive adoption and make sure everybody is satisfied with how the process turns out.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because no matter how good the tool is, if you've not taken the time to gather those prerequisites and figure out where am I trying to go with this tool, you're probably not going to be satisfied with the outcome. The second step in this is, once you've identified what your outcome it should be, what it should look like, how do you get there? How do you get from point A to point Z? So a lot of times when you're creating your patching plan, it's good to break the plan up into pieces and determine who's responsible for what part of the plan, how communication is going to work. Communication is essential to successful patching, because you have so many involved stakeholders. You have the users of the systems themselves. You have your security, your SecOps team that's responsible for keeping those systems secure. You have application developers who are responsible for keeping the applications on those machines up and running. So part of determining the required steps is, how do you communicate and with whom do you communicate?
Yeah, coming
So that would
down
be
with
like,
just pure fiat is the fastest way to piss everyone off and find out that you don't know how to make a real process at all.
this is
Yes,
also an important time in which to engage those other teams and make sure there is that alignment, because you'll get to number 4, and if you don't have the right teams engaged, you won't be validating what you think you are.
exactly. So then once you've determined those steps, you build out your process, and we'll look at a few different processes. We'll look at doing, a one-off ad hoc type patch scenario. We'll look at baselines, particularly in the context of patching an application server. And we'll also look at patch automation as well. So determining those required steps and building out your process. And then finally, as Casey points out when he alluded to step 4, is making sure the process makes sense. Does the process get you to the desired outcome? If it does, that's great. You still want to keep monitoring that process and reviewing it periodically, because sometimes a process that worked a quarter ago or a year ago, when changes are made in the environment, that process is no longer sufficient and it needs to be tweaked, it needs to be modified. And
Uh,
so that's very important to validate the process.
I think, as we all know, change is one of the few constants in our industry.
Huge changes too,
Now,
not little things.
and the one of the other constants is the end user saying they restarted the machine when they didn't restart the machine, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Rhonda, that sounds like you've got some experience with that.
Well,
I
just
think
in
we all do.
general, yeah, I think one of the things that I know, sometimes management can seem like, those evil overlords, but, it is important for them to be able to see the state of their environment, right? So starting to use BigFix in this environment also allows you to be able to report to see the security levels of your environment. And yeah, you can see when machines haven't been rebooted. You can see when patches aren't fully in effect, that kind of thing. So um, that is also part of the reason why we have those soft skills that Joe was talking about. Is you are as an administrator now going to have better visibility. You're going to have people have visibility into your environment that you maybe aren't used to. So it's a double-edged sword from that perspective.
Yeah, and to your point about the evil overlords, when I work for my managed services provider, I sought daily to be a benevolent overlord and not an evil overlord. I was tried to be benevolent. So with that, we're going to have a few demonstrations during this segment. So, one of the first steps, once you've created your process, the business process behind the tool that you're using, then we're going to enable the appropriate sites, subscribe computers, and we're going to take a look at the download whitelist file. That's an important component to the BigFix architecture, and we'll get into that more in detail shortly. We'll look at delivering a single patch. Many customers, have scenarios where they just need to patch specific things. So we'll look at delivering just a single patch, followed by an example of patching a LAMP server using a baseline. So we'll take a look at patching an application server. We'll look at patch automation. And then finally, we will look at getting really granular with our patching and using tools within BigFix to target specific CVEs. So we'll see a variety of things here, a variety of scenarios where we're casting really wide nets and even getting as specific to the CVE level. So allow me to change my view to my BigFix console. And we're going to take a look at site enablement. So a lot of you may know, if you've used BigFix for any period of time, by default, we do not turn everything on out of the box as far as sites.
So, Ken, why would that be? Why wouldn't we want to enable everything out of the box? Why would we want to be more specific about what's enabled?
Yeah, and that's a good question. So the analogy that I'll draw here is like drinking out of a fire hose. BigFix provides an enormous wealth of content. We have hundreds of thousands of pieces of content that are delivered from our content delivery network. And most organizations only really require a subset of that content. And so to turn all that on, number one, is going to be potentially overwhelming for a BigFix admin to sift through, especially if they're new to the solution. And it can also generate some unnecessary overhead too. So to make things as simple, straightforward, and efficient as possible, we only turn on by default the absolute necessary content out of the box and enable the customer to determine what content that they are going to turn on.
The Ubuntu sites in particular are a really good case study in this effect. They are our single largest set of sites. They have around 30,000 pieces of content in each of them, which is 2 to 3 times what we usually carry in even the Windows patch site. So there's just a huge number of them. And then when you go and subscribe all of those to the console, you're now, every time you open it, having to evaluate all of those fixlets. It's
Yeah.
not a heavy performance impact on the clients because they'll, for the most part, non-Ubuntu systems will ignore them, but your console experience will just be much worse turning all of this stuff on.
Yeah, that's a very good point too. And so once you're in BigFix management, you would go to license overview. Patch customers or remediate customers would select either patch or remediate. I'm licensed here for lifecycle, so I'm going to go in here to lifecycle. And as I scroll down, you'll notice I have more than one site for patches for Ubuntu. So these are version specific. So I have patches for Ubuntu 18.04. I have patches for Ubuntu 20.04 and then patches for Ubuntu 22.04.
So then can these look to be specific to the LTS versions of Ubuntu?
Yeah, that's correct. So one thing to make note of is we provide patch content strictly for the LTS releases. So any of the interim releases in between those long-term releases, we don't provide out-of-the-box content for, simply because those releases are not supported for nearly as long as the LTS releases. Now that being said, if you have in your environment, let's say Ubuntu 23.04, which is not an LTS release, you can create custom fixlet content to patch that if that's something that you need. And we can definitely, your technical advisor can certainly assist you with that. So reach out to your technical advisor if that's a use case that you've got and you need some assistance with. But to your point, Casey, only LTS releases are supported out of the box.
Now, I don't see a site right there for 2404. Did you already activate it, or is that available yet?
So that's another good question. Ubuntu 24.04, which was just released last month, according to our platform development team, we will have out-of-the-box patching content for that by end of June. It is actually undergoing certification to ensure that everything is working as planned. So once that content is fully validated and QA'd, that will be forthcoming within the next month or so.
Good deal. Thanks, Ken.
So for a lot of our BigFix administrators, this is probably going to look really elementary. Yeah, Ken, I know all about enabling sites, but the reason I show it is in the past, few weeks, I've been working with some customers that are getting started with patching, and they say, well, I have the agent installed on my machines, but I don't see any patches for them. So my first question is, do you have these sites activated? So that's really step one. Make sure that you have the appropriate content sites activated. I recommend only activating sites for versions of Ubuntu that you are actively patching and supporting. To Joe's point, you don't want to go in here and just turn on everything. So if you have, like in my case, 18.04, 20.04, and 22.04, then activate those sites, but nothing else. The next pitfall that some of my customers have reported is, okay, well, I've activated the site, but I still don't see any patches. Have you subscribed the computers to the sites? Once again, for some of us, that may seem pretty straightforward, but it's important to make sure that we understand how BigFix works out of the box. Out of the box, a very limited number of sites are enabled by default. Only a few sites have machines that are subscribed to them by default. We do this by design to keep things efficient. So the first thing, enable your sites. Once you've verified that you're appropriately licensed, then subscribe your computers. And let me show you how I've chosen to subscribe computers in here. So bear with me one moment. So we'll look at my patches for Ubuntu 18.04. So Joe, tell us about this site level relevance, first of all.
Sure. Yeah. So this is a tricky little tip here, not super related to subscribing the sites, subscribing endpoints to the sites. But if you take a look at that external subscription constraints site level relevance, this is a great thing to like kind of steal out of here and use in any of your content. So for all of our sites that have OS specific content like Ubuntu, like patches for Windows, all of those sites, this site level relevance is an easy vetted thing that you can use in any of your content to determine what the OS version is. Like if you are creating content for Ubuntu 18.04, you can just copy paste this straight out of there into your Fixlet, and you can be absolutely sure that it will target only this OS version.
Yep. So a good takeaway from that is, instead of writing your own relevance, if relevance already exists that does what you needed to do, why reinvent the wheel? So in my case, for my computer subscriptions, I've chosen to use computers will be subscribed to this site which match this condition. The OS contains this string 18.04.
Then make sure you remember to click the Save Changes button. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to subscribe computers and just forgotten.
Right.
What happens?
Not
What
actually
happens if
save
you
my
move
changes.
off that, Joe? So if you're on this page and you move off of it without hitting save, what's going to happen?
Nothing. You have no computer subscribed.
Yep.
It's very frustrating.
It's
Yep.
not ideal. That was not the plan in general.
Yep, it's happened to me a number of times, and some people might ask, so Ken, what is the significance of this string 18.04? And it's a unique string that occurs only for Linux Ubuntu 18.04 LTS. So no other operating system, whether a Linux distribution or a Windows version, is going to include this string within its operating system identifier. So I like to keep my constraints simple while I ensure that they're going to be accurate and only point to what I want. So in this case, I could have used the full OS string if I wanted, but as a sysadmin, I like to just be short and to the point. So once you do the subscriptions, as machines check in, verify that the machines that you expect to be subscribed to that site are showing up, and that machines that you don't expect aren't showing up as well. So that's another important thing. And then once you have your computer subscriptions set up, a couple other key takeaways here is this download whitelist.txt file. So this is my download whitelist.txt file from my home lab. And you'll notice there are a number of URLs or URL patterns here using regular expressions. So let's talk a little bit about this download whitelist file. Joe, what is the download whitelist file?
So the download whitelist file allows BigFix operators to determine what clients are allowed to dynamically download. So we don't need to add any sort of domains here for any of our static content, You can see this oftentimes in the Windows patch site. We have a single patch file for a single patch. It's hard coded in the relevance, so it'll never change. So we know it's secure. We know what URL we're hitting. Everything's great. We don't need to use this. But part of the cool thing about the Ubuntu patch content is that we dynamically determine what dependencies are required for a patch and then go and download those files as well. This means that things have to be, like those URLs, those sizes, those hashes have to be determined dynamically. And so now you kind of open up this security hole where, geez, if a client can download from any URL anywhere dynamically, and it could change after an operator has deployed the action, then we need an extra layer of security, right? We don't want something to be able to substitute in some malicious URL for an Ubuntu patch string, right? Like that's really bad. But we get around that by whitelisting them here in this download whitelist text file, and only allow clients to dynamically download from trusted sources. So only the Ubuntu, the archive Ubuntu domain, the security Ubuntu domain, and so forth.
Yeah, and this is particularly relevant with regards to Linux operating systems because, as you point out, Windows typically is pulling stuff from Windows Update and a few other URLs that almost never change. But with Ubuntu and other Linux distributions, number one, they implement the concept of mirrors. So you might need to download content from a specific mirror in a specific geographic location. So you would want to put the URL for that mirror in here. You might have, a number of our customers, particularly Red Hat customers, will have their own custom repositories on site that they manage off an SMB server or something like that. So in which case, if they have a custom local repo, they would need to define that here in the download whitelist file.
What happens, Ken, if somebody doesn't update this whitelist file and attempts to run Ubuntu patching? What's the risk of not having this updated?
Especially if archive.ubuntu.com and security.ubuntu.com are not included in this whitelist, then the attempt at patching will fail. BigFix will not download the content, and this is by design to prevent the scenario that Joe was explaining, to prevent a malicious download. So once you have prepared this download whitelist file, then you're essentially ready to patch. So what I've done in my instance is I like to put everything in its own custom site. I don't like to put things in the master action site.
Why is that, Ken?
So the master action site is the one site that every computer that registers with BigFix talks to. So for example, if you put Ubuntu patch content in the master action site, your Windows and Mac machines, when they check in, would evaluate that content. Now, it's not going to make it relevant, but you're going to incur some overhead by cramming the master action site full of things that will never be relevant for endpoints in your environment. So it's very good practice to ensure that you have custom sites deployed whenever and wherever possible, and to keep the master action site as clean as possible. The less you put in the master action site, the better the results you're going to have. A number of customers that I've done health checks for that have said, hey, my BigFix environment's running really slowly. What we find in many cases, not all, is they've put a lot of things in the master action site that really are more appropriate for a custom site.
Yeah, I like to think of it. Sorry, Joe. I like to think of it as if it's globally available. So policies that are for client settings, global things, sometimes groups used for other subscriptions. Those are the kind of things I like to have in the master action site. Otherwise, if it's specific to a set of endpoints or a specific business use case, get a custom site in place. Put your content in there, make it available as appropriate. Sorry, Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, in my experience with my customers, the absolute fastest way for them to burn down their clients is to just load up the master action site with content. And fun performance factoid about the client, there's actually a strategy we use called sidelining within the client, where if a very rarely changing piece of relevance evaluates to false, so something we expect to not change until, say, the system restarts, like in this case, OS version, once that's evaluated to false on the client, it will sideline it, which you might have seen if you've looked through logs before, and that means it will not evaluate that content again until the next time it's restarted. So we gain quite a bit of efficiency, even if you do something silly like load up your master action site with all your OS patches or something like that.
Gotcha. That's helpful to know. So we're ready to push out, a patch. We now have our sites enabled. We have computers subscribed. We have computers reporting in. So I'm going to select my Ubuntu 18.04 machine here. And you'll notice we have 452 relevant fixlets and tasks. So let's go in here to fixlets and let's expand by site.
So Ken, while you're doing that, I see that content exists. You've got those 450 some. Are you saying that the existence of content doesn't automatically patch it? There's more steps?
Yes. So if we're looking at a scenario where we're doing patching entirely manually, then as by definition, manually patching requires some manual intervention. So in this case, we're going to go into our patches for Ubuntu. We notice we've got 351 available patches. In this case, we want to prioritize things. Let's look at the high severity. So that narrows it down to about 8. So I'm just going to select one at random, this policy kit vulnerability. And for those of you that have been doing Windows patching at this point, this is going to look very similar to what you've been doing. There's not really going to be any difference here. We had to take some additional steps to get to this point, but at this point, this is going to look very familiar. So in this case, we're going to take default action. And for our execution, just like with Windows patching or other fixlets and tasks, we can set our execution constraints. For our post action, by default, we suppress the reboot. So I'm just going to take this action as it is. Now, if this were a production system, I would not want to start this patch right now. This could be potentially disruptive. So in production, I would schedule this sometime after hours. Since this is my home lab, I'm just going to go ahead and push it out.
So Ken, you chose a subset of fixlets to look at. What goes into your decision making criteria? There's 351 things that could go. You decided to look at high. Is that just based on your knowledge as a working with your security teams on a regular basis? Are those the ones that are going to be least disruptive? We talked about like strategies of how we select what we're going to do. What's your strategy, or what's a good strategy to look at when you are potentially overwhelmed by 30,000 pieces of content?
Right. So coming to this as the former CISO of a managed services provider, where I had to make these business decisions day in and day out, coupled with the fact that as human beings, we need about 8 hours of sleep a day. We work about 8 hours a day, and then the remaining 8 hours we have to split up between eating, interacting with family if we must, and things of that sort. So the point is, time is something that we're limited on, and so we have to prioritize. And so to draw an analogy, if I'm worried about securing my home, what am I going to worry most about? That I'm missing the front door on my house, or that a light bulb in my closet's burned out, right? So I have to evaluate these threats. And in this manual process, a lot of manual work goes into this, right? Because I had to go in and manually select that patch. I had to come to a decision entirely on my own without any automation helping me. So yeah, a lot of work goes into that, Rhonda. And so if I'm doing a manual patch, I'm having to evaluate, number one, how severe is the vulnerability that I'm fixing? Does the vulnerability exist in my environment? Because if it doesn't, it might be a software vulnerability that's rated as high, but it might require Cannady to come over to my house and physically access my computer. Since I know he is not going to come over to my house, that's not necessarily a threat, even though the vulnerability exists. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, ensuring that the
And I thought you guys were friends.
Yeah, but he's still not coming over to my house. But yeah, at the end of the day, you have to take into consideration all the factors. You know, how severe is the vulnerability? Is it exploitable? How trivial it is to exploit? What is the risk if I don't patch? You know, what's the impact? And also, what is the risk if I do patch? Because I think we've all ran into situations where a vendor has released a patch and the cure was worse than the disease. Several years ago, I pushed out a patch for a customer that was rated low on the severity scale, and I thought, I'll just push this patch out. And it had an unknown, undocumented side effect of uninstalling the network adapter drivers for Intel Pro 400 series NICs. So after spending a week and a half talking customers through the phone on how to manually reinstall their network adapter drivers, I learned an important lesson. Not every single patch needs to be necessarily pushed out.
Yeah.
Well, you haven't really earned your system administrator wings until you've blown up a huge chunk of your environment with a Windows patch. So way to go, Ken. Got your wings.
Somehow that doesn't make me feel much better, but I appreciate the attempt. So yeah, that's the manual process here. And while we were talking, the machine's reported in, the patch is applied, and now the status is set to fixed. So then the next thing that comes up, and Casey and I were talking about this earlier, what if you're wanting to patch something more specific and yet, you know, far-reaching, like an application server?
So, Ken, with that, maybe we could look at something that's a web server based, like a Nginx or Apache.
Okay. So in this example here,
Hey, look at that.
yeah, you speak it and it comes into existence. So LAMP, which many of our customers have deployed, stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. There's some variations on that acronym, but at the core, it's an application server. It's the basis for running web apps. And so because it has several components, doing a onesie twosie ad hoc patching for a LAMP server doesn't really make sense. It's not going to lend itself well to scaling, and you may end up with inconsistent results, because if we're patching entirely manually, then we have to make sure that we deploy every single patch the same on every single machine, and there's always that chance for error to creep in. So a baseline is a container, essentially a logical container, that contains patches or other fixlets and tasks, as well as it can also contain other baselines as well. So going back to the point I raised at the beginning, where, you know, once you determine the desired outcome, in this case, our desired outcome is we want to patch security vulnerabilities on a LAMP server. It's a very specific desired outcome that we're stating here. It's not enough just to say we want to patch Ubuntu. We want to patch Ubuntu servers that are running a LAMP stack, and we're wanting to patch security vulnerabilities. So what I've done is my process, I've broken it up into pieces. The first part of LAMP, the L, is for Linux. So I've created an entry here, a component group for patching my Linux kernel. I've also added this restart needed action here.
Why would that be, Ken? What's the need for doing that after that first step?
So for anyone that has administered Linux, typically after you do a kernel update, a reboot is needed, because you need to reboot the system into the new kernel after the grub bootloader has been updated. So we kick off the kernel update, and then after that update completes, then we kick off the restart. Once the system comes back up, the baseline continues. The next component is the Apache component. If you're using a different web server like Nginx, you can also substitute Nginx here, and basically you're patching your web server next. You can add additional fixlets and tasks here. Let's say you want to, after you patch Nginx or Apache, you want to restart the service. You can add a restart service action here in this group. And then next we have the MySQL, MariaDB, PostgreSQL updates that are needed. And then finally PHP to complete LAMP.
So Ken, this looks like it could be leveraged to remediate drift within an environment, endpoint
Yes.
drift.
Yeah, because this baseline can be pushed out either as a one-time action to play, patch catch-up, for example. It can also be set up as a policy action. So as soon as devices check into the site that this baseline is configured for and is set for running at an interval, you can ensure that even if you are bringing up a LAMP server from an outdated image that doesn't have the updated Linux kernel, they're very quickly getting these updates, and they're getting them in a uniform and reproducible manner.
And I have a beef. I can't believe that you did not take the opportunity to call this the I Love LAMP baseline. This is just, it's a crime against memes. I'm offended.
I am terribly sorry. I will try to do better.
That's all we can ask.
Maybe I can make it up for you by showing you how to fully automate a patching process. Would that make you feel better, Joe?
A little bit.
Okay.
You better
So
be
Ken,
renaming
like
your policy, though.
You're jumping from the console to the web UI. Are we going to look at something different now?
We are going to look at something different. That's a good eye.
Oh, wow.
Is that what they teach you guys over there in AVP?
It is.
I'm not AVP. I'm ProServe.
Oh, okay. Joe's
You
like,
know,
I thought
potato, potato.
Yeah, I thought you guys
We're
were friends.
one big happy family.
Yeah,
That's
we're
right.
all one. Yeah. So exactly, we're going over into Web UI, and as you can see, Web UI shows me the same deployments that I would see in my BigFix console. So here we see that policy kit vulnerability that I pushed out yesterday or today, and we can see that it succeeded. We can see another patch I pushed out yesterday that failed. So I'm seeing the same data here as I would see in my console. Web UI has something that the console does not. Actually has several things, but in this context, we're going to talk about patch policies or patch automation. So I've created a patch policy here specifically for Ubuntu 18.04.
I think it's important to point out that you did a version specific on that, and I know you're going to get into that more later, but I just want to call that out for folks to pay attention to, that these do need to be tailored more.
Yeah,
and we'll get into why.
And there's a couple reasons why. So first of all, as a sysadmin, I always wanted to build a policy or an action that did one thing really well, that was easy to manage, easy to scale, and I didn't spend a lot of time trying to figure out, what I actually did before I slept last. So in this case, I give it a very simple name. I give it a description. In this case, I even in the description say when I last modified it and why. So what I essentially do here after I create it, notice I've put it in a custom site. I have not put it in the master action site, and we've already covered why. Use custom sites whenever you possibly can. And I'll tell a funny story about one of the first versions of patch policies in Web UI. You'll notice in this dropdown, you can only select one OS family. In a previous version of this, there were checkboxes here. And you could literally select everything from Amazon Linux to Windows. And we had a customer that did that, and patch policies did not work very well as a result, because it generated a lot of overhead and a lot of noise. So on a subsequent update to Web UI, we made it to where you can only subscribe one OS family to each patch policy that you create. So in this case, we're going to select Ubuntu, and then we can define our categories. I always like to keep security and bug fix in the same policy. I leave enhancements out because if I'm worried about security, I'm not necessarily worried about, hey, is this version of the K desktop environment prettier, right? Unless it's a security patch, I'm not concerned about it as a cyber security practitioner. I'm going to select OS updates, and this is where it gives me all the flavors of Ubuntu. Now,
and just because you can check all of them does not mean that you should.
Exactly. So in this case, I'm going to select 18.04. And here's where we get to the keyword criteria. And Joe, I think you and I were talking about this yesterday.
Yeah, so patch policy, as you define what content goes in here, and that's really what we're talking about with the policy portion of this. This just defines what fixlets end up being deployed as a result of this content, and we refresh those every month or every week, however long you want. And so the keyword criteria here is kind of the power play where you can set up this use case in an automated fashion by adding just Apache, just MySQL, just PHP, just kernel patches, right? And so we only have those 4 keywords. Anything with that in the name shows up in this baseline. And so we've exercised a pretty serious level of control with just like plain language.
Exactly. And to complement that point, you notice for severity, I've only selected critical and important. And the reason being is we want to automate critical patching, because if we have something comes out that has a high impact, a high degree of being exploited, we don't want to rely on manual processes to patch that. We just want it patched and done. At the same time, we don't necessarily want to include moderate and low.
And that goes back to the reason that you were mentioning, Ken, where unintended consequences
Exactly.
of deploying patches.
Exactly. Now, that being said, and I'll save this policy here. That being said, we still recommend that you adhere to best practices and have a dev or testing group that you are executing this policy against.
You kind of blew past a couple of things there I just want to highlight. One is this auto refresh. So this is the magic of policy. So with refresh cycles, you can say like once a month, I want to go check for anything new. So you can, if you're doing your own baselines, you can go into the site and you can look at, what's in there, and you can create your baselines and take actions, based on your knowledge. The beauty of a policy is that you don't have to go look. You can set those values, and you can say once a month, go look, update this, 2 days before my normal patching window cycle is going to, or patching, not Windows because this is Ubuntu, but patching window when those servers are available for us to patch. And so this will happen, and we'll be able to then go to the next part, which is the scheduling piece of it. The other piece that was right before this was if you want to take pre or post action. So I have one customer who, before they go into a patch policy, they reboot. So they have a reboot as a pre-action. They go through all of the steps, and then at the end, they reboot again. And they do that all with patch policy to make sure that they've got a clean slate to start with and a clean slate at the end. And hopefully that keeps all the servers that they're patching, happy, healthy, and wise.
Right.
Another interesting use case for the auto refresh in patch policies is things like browsers. We all know that browsers are a major point of problems these days, and lots of maybe not 0-day, but critical releases occurring from vendors. And having a patch policy that refreshes either weekly or even daily, and then attacks those vulnerabilities immediately, has been very beneficial to a number of customers of mine.
Yeah, browsers, in particular are a pain point because 20 years ago, they were used exclusively to browse the internet, which is why they were called browsers. but now they're being used for so much else. FTP client, chat, running SaaS applications. And so the attack surface on a browser is much larger today than it was 20 or 25 years ago, because the web browser has been co-opted to doing more than just simply browsing the web. So that's a very good point there. And when you mention vulnerabilities, one of the final things I wanted to show, we think of BigFix as a patching solution, which it is, but we can also do so much more with it. We're a vulnerability remediation tool. And so one of the features within BigFix is our CVE search dashboard. So suppose you get a call like I did several years ago about a particular CVE, commonly referred to as WannaCry. My boss calls me in a panic on Saturday and says, Ken, how are we doing as far as patching against this CVE? And we were using a product, a non-BigFix product, that we were having some issues with, to say the least. And so we had to manually go through all of our customers' machines to try to find out if the applicable patch was deployed, which is not efficient. So in this case, what we're able to do with our CVE search, we can add this CVE here, and this is one that I've confirmed exists in my environment, so I know it's real. I'm going to run this CVE search, and it's going to come back with some results. It's going to say, number one, since I've got a finding, it's present. It gives me the fixlet count, the instances found, which I have one. I can then go in here, select this CVE. Not only can I see if I've got it in my environment, I can go ahead and click Create Content. And you'll see up here in the title bar, it says Create Baseline. I can create a baseline specifically for fixing that CVE across the board. So in this case, just to make sure it's easy for me to find later, I'm going to reference the specific CVE here. I'm going to click OK. And it's in the background building out the components I need to fix this vulnerability. And you notice I've got 6 fixlets that can be deployed. In this case, I've got one for Debian, which I could exclude if I wanted to. But now that I've got my CVE built, and once again, this was built out automatically by BigFix, I can then go take action. And as computers check in, I can dynamically target by property. And as those machines check in, this baseline is automatically going to get deployed. I can also set this as a policy action, in which case it can run at an interval. So if, once again, my infrastructure team is building new machines and deploying them off an outdated image, this baseline is automatically going to get pushed out to those machines as they come into production. I don't have to manually go in and patch those machines.
So as we're coming to the end of our, go ahead, John, sorry.
Yeah, while I pause in the action, there are a couple of questions around patch policy. If we could maybe get around to those either in the text or verbally. Also,
yeah, I've been getting those out.
Yeah, and you'll notice that this baseline, because maybe this is like a ultra critical 0-day kind of event, Ken's included multiple OSs in this particular baseline. That's usually not what we do, but maybe this is that important that you just want to get it out there as quickly as possible, and you don't want to have a lot of overhead, so you're going to throw this out there with everything in it. So,
yep, that's a good point, Rhonda. So yeah, good rules of thumb for this are, number one, keep your baselines as simple and targeted as possible. There is a way of manually syncing baseline components when they get superseded or when new components are updated. So you can manually sync your baselines, but it does require you to remember to do it and actually do that. Whereas patch policies, that auto refresh, that's kind of handled in the background.
Terrific. So I think we've I think we did what we said, right? We talked about, what's our outcome? What do we want to do? We've talked about how to get there, the things that we need to do within BigFix to get there, and we've talked about a number of other kind of best practices. It looks like there's some additional resources here we want to talk to, and then I think we need to wrap up our conversation for today.
Yeah, so the first article that's listed here is by one of my good colleagues, Brad Sexton. Many of you probably know him from LinkedIn and the content he posts there. He fortuitously, about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, created this article on setting maintenance schedules. So I highly recommend reading this and using that in conjunction with anything that you may have learned during this segment. We also have published a patching guide on our website specifically for Ubuntu, as well as other Linux distributions, as well as Windows. So there's a link to it here as well. And I think John will be putting these links in the chat as well. Finally, LWN, Linux World News, has a security resources page where all the major distribution vendors, Debian, Fedora, Red Hat, SUSE, will post on a weekly basis their security updates. That way, if you don't have another way of seeing, what's out there, this is a good resource just to see what vendors are publishing as far as available security updates, so you can stay ahead of things.
To that point too, make sure and subscribe to either the forum or the BigFix mailing service so that you get those notifications when we do release that content into your BES environment through the CDN.
Yeah, I know when I was sitting in that chair and trying to keep up with content, those emails, sometimes I didn't look at them individually as they came in, but when that inevitable phone call came and it said, what happened with MS blah, 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 or Ubuntu blah, 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 I could go to my little archive of email and search, find all the emails that had that in it, see when was the initial patch released, if it had been updated, what the latest was on that. Maybe it had been superseded and I needed to go follow some supersedence train. And those emails at least gave me a starting point, which was really good. So.
Yep. And I do the forum one where you can subscribe to different sections of the forum. So you can subscribe to the content section of the forum and it will email you every time someone from the BigFix team updates the content section with the appropriate selections you've made. So a very cool service.
Yeah, I think I have a couple of slides on that, so I'll put those, speaking of forum, I'll put those in the event section for this particular event, post those slides out there just for people to reference and the links, and I think John has put those also in the chat. By the way, John Talbert's lurking in the background. He's not on camera with us, but he's definitely helping us out with all of the background questions, so thank you, John, for being here. And with that, let's go ahead and wrap up. We're right at the end of our time, so thank you all for being here. As mentioned, we did record this webinar. If you want to go back, take some screenshots, that kind of thing, please feel free. Also feel free to reach out to any of us. We'll be happy to discuss with you further on any of the topics that we covered today. And we'll be coming up with our topic for next month. It'll be the last Wednesday of the month next month. So we're looking forward to having you join us again next time. Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Casey. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for having
John.
me.
All right. Have a wonderful day. Bye, all.
You too.
Thanks, all.
Bye, everyone.